everyone. Welcome to this interview with Professor Rukmini Sen for Doing Sociology. As already stated, she is a professor of sociology in the School of Liberal Studies, Ambedkar University, Delhi. Her research and teaching interests are in the areas of sociology of law, feminist pedagogy, narrative methods, relationships, and intimacies. She is also a member of the Indian Association for Women's Studies and has served in its executive committee. Her recent co-edited book, Doing Feminisms in the Academy, Identity, Institutional Pedagogy, and Critical Classrooms in India and the UK, was published by Zuban. We welcome you, ma'am, to our platform, and thank you so much for taking time out for us and doing this interview amidst your busy schedule.
Thank you very much, Rituparna, as well as Deepali, for getting in touch with me. It's, of course, a huge honor and a nostalgia at the same point of time to be doing something with Center for Study in Social Systems of JNU, where I did my master's in sociology. And it's wonderful that doing sociology is happening in the way and in the platform in which you are doing it. I follow your blogs quite intently. I'm also a very good Instagram follower of yours. So I do want to state that taking different platforms to disseminate knowledge of the social is something which Doing Sociology is doing, and I'm very proud to be, being part of this conversation.
Thank you so much, ma'am. So, viewers and students, especially AUD students, you heard what Professor Sen said. So, go follow us on Instagram. She's following us. So, let's just get the conversation flowing. Ma'am, you were one of the first ones to actually talk about how when we think about, the home and the domestic space, how it could be a differentiated and unequal space for, many parts of the population, as you've shown in your pieces in both EPW and NewsClick. So could you elaborate a little bit on that, on this idea of the home and domestic space as sanctuaries?
Right. Yes. I think that the engagement with home, with the concept of the home, has come recently through the pandemic, and I would think that the pandemic gave an opportunity to actually rethink the concept of the home from my disciplinary lens in sociology. Both in the NewsClick piece that you mentioned, as well as in the EPW piece, there are ways in which I talk about the home. But I think a very recent piece that I now have, it's actually a blog in what is called the Gender Ed, which is hosted by the University of Edinburgh. And I titled that blog, Returning Home and Violence Within Home, COVID-19 and Multiple Gendered Violations. And there, I actually start to talk about what are the different ways in which this word home has been confronted during the pandemic. And as a student teacher in sociology, one is wanting to think about what kind of gender-based implications and consequences of that confrontation with the home during pandemic happens. So number one is stay at home. And I'm sure all of us are aware of the number of advisories that came to us, which told us the need to stay at home and to practice physical distancing. But it was only a matter of time before we understood that the implications of stay at home goes in conjunction with work from home. And that is going to have serious implications on gender-based work, definitely care work and other kinds of household work. So that's the first. The second is work from home. And for most of the urban upper middle class women in India, that has meant disproportionate domestic labor. Finding work-life balance has become difficult, if not impossible, primarily because of the increase in care work, in addition to professional work. And we have to remember that for most of the upper middle class, urban women in India, there are usually domestic helps who would come and take care of a certain part of that household work during the first absolutely 3 months of the lockdown, the grueling phase. All of that stopped, and therefore increase in domestic labor happened. Not to mention that the way in which domestic workers were affected as a result of the pandemic needs and warrants a separate discussion altogether. A third way in which the discussion of the home happened during the pandemic is in regard to violence within the home, or what we would call domestic violence. And clearly there is data now which shows that there is an increase in domestic violence. National Commission for Women have come out with data. Of course, the UN talks about it as well. Domestic violence as the shadow pandemic during the COVID-19. The fourth way in which we see home during the pandemic is the images of migrant workers, a bulk of whom were women and children, walking back home and traveling unimaginable distances by foot due to the sudden announcement of the nationwide lockdown. What this clearly demonstrated is that big cities do not actually become homes for migrant workers, and they come there to work, mostly, let's say, as construction workers, seasonal migrants, etc. And we understand the precarity of staying in these big cities, and that's the reason why they had to walk back home. Finally, the fifth and the last way with which I feel that we've confronted the home is that the anxiety as well as hope around homecoming. For many students who stay in hostels or halls of residences away from their parents, or in rented apartments in cities where they work within or outside the country, away from their original natal or marital homes, traveling back home for a certain class of people, let's say to take a flight or an AC train, to come home or to come back to the country of origin, has been disrupted and shaken up in ways that has never happened in the recent past. So, these are the 5 ways in which I think that sociologically, it is an interesting moment to engage with the concept of the home during the pandemic. I would think that we can draw important lessons from meanings of the home, which was conceptualized during the birth of the nation. South Asia gets created, the disruption, the fragmentation of South Asia and the creation of India, Pakistan, etc. is connected with loss of home and recovery of home. So I'm just kind of trying to think that there is also a past around reconceptualizations of home that we might want to think about.
Thank you for that answer. My next question is related to what you've talked about again. So, the use of slogans such as stay home, stay safe, they reflect a lack of empathy and cognitive invisibility that stems from a gender blind perception. So do you see this as a persistence of gender blind approach, or do you think that this gender blindedness is coupled with a neoliberal imaginary of a state that visualizes its relationship to citizens very differently?
So, yes, I would think that it's the answer is yes to both your questions. But if I have to elaborate, then the way in which I would look at it is that we have to remember, foreground, and reiterate that gendered approaches to the home has always been a part of sociological and feminist sociological inquiry. And within sociology, as well as feminist studies, there has been a transformative shift around the discussion of domestic work I'm just kind of trying to link that, discussion around domestic work with stay at home, work from home, which is, the kind of advisory that came since March 16, 2020, from the government of India. And it might be valuable for us to go back and read Betty Friedan's Feminine Mystique, or our very own Anne Oakley's The Sociology of Housework, or even Maitreyi Krishnaraj and Vibhuti Patel's Women's Liberation and the Political Economy of Housework, an Indian Perspective. Because all of these go on to make a critical engagement with gendered dimensions of roles performed inside the household, and very clearly stay at home, work from home increased that role manifold. So not only did domestic violence increase during the pandemic, gendered work within the household also increased tremendously during the pandemic and its subsequent lockdown. So that is something that we need to keep in mind. So, while the lockdown is, led to a certain kind of impact on middle and upper middle class women, but on the other hand, it exposed the complete precarity of the paid domestic workers, one of the many women in the informal workspace in India where caste and gender intersects usually, most of whom are women, who are actually left at the whims and goodwill of the employers, whether to pay or not pay their wages, since they are not coming to home to do our work. So in engendering the pandemic through the concept of the home, I believe that it is very important that we hear multiple kinds of voices. We hear voices from domestic workers, from professional women with or without children, because the experiences have been very, very different. Women taking care of the elderly or the disabled parents, all of them need to be heard to actually think about a different kind of a feminist reimagination around, not just the home, but also the way in which, we need to visualize and talk about that what goes inside the home doesn't remain only in the private space. So it is no more a public-private neat binary in which we can actually talk about the home. And I think that is very, very important to get connected with the manner in which we construct the idea of the citizen, and, and talk about and reclaim the spirit of democracy and participation, not just in a very narrow sense of a political space, but also within the domestic space. How do we talk about that? I think the pandemic gives us an opportunity to think about citizenship very, 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 very imaginatively.
I think that's a very important point that you've made, rethinking citizenship and taking into account, keeping in mind whatever is happening now and has happened in the past few months. So again, thank you for that answer. Now I'd go on to quote you, you've written the following: the risks and difficulties of single women getting housing in big cities in India are real. It is therefore relevant to raise discussions around affordable, civic, community, abuse-free, secure, livable housing, not connected with marriage and not imagined only by the upper middle class, economically earning women in some metropolitans in India. The discussion on domestic violence can no longer continue to happen in isolation from rethinking the discourse surrounding the home. So, then I would like to ask you, this implies that an approach has to comprehend the intersectionalities of class, caste, heteronormativity, and perhaps even community to imagine housing for women. So do you think such a conversation is happening at the moment, right? And what are the obstacles which you see in policymakers taking the lives of those women whose lives simply disappear from the lens of the state? So if you could throw some light on this.
Thank you very much, Deepali, for that question, because I do feel that that's That's such a valuable, what should I say, such a valuable inquiry that we need more research on, around housing. So the way I would like to engage with this is, and thank you for quoting, from the PWSA, the way I would like to address this is, see, conversations around housing in the Indian context has primarily happened in connection to eviction and slum demolition. That has been one consistent, civil society engagement with the context and with the demand for affordable housing. But as I said, it is either Juggi Jhopri demolition or eviction from, one's own, where one is staying. So in that context, there have been two associations, civil society organizations, who have actually raised this question for a long time now. One is Housing and Land Rights Network, or otherwise known as HRLN. They have been doing, brilliant work around affordable housing for marginalized communities, basically in the context of urban poor. There's also a National Forum for Housing Rights in various cities in India. Again, the focus has been around eviction, slum demolition, so actually connecting it with questions of poverty, development, the way in which cities need to be cleansed from the poor. And that is the reason why you evict them from, main spaces and, throw them somewhere else where they would become invisible. Yeah. So that is the conversation, and that is the kind of political discourse around housing which has happened. I would, however, want to say that as much as this, this discourse is very important, and I would think that one needs to learn a lot from this discourse and think, how is it that some of the language and especially some of the rights language that has been used in this discourse, how can we use it now? It brings me to this, the way in which in the last few years, I would think that there has been a discussion around women and not necessarily home, but, some understanding of space that has come. And I would think that, hostels, this entire discourse that has happened around hostels, of course, through the Pinjra Tor campaign, etc., I think there is, if we push that discussion further, then we will actually end up getting to that point on access to higher education is connected with affordable living in cities where you get the best of higher education. So I would think that one of the questions that, the Pinjra Tor campaign is raising, if we push it further, then it is actually this, that if you don't ensure affordable housing, then you will not have women from, from Mofussil towns or others, other smaller cities coming into bigger cities like Delhi, Bombay, Bangalore for higher education. Yeah. So that's one space where I would think affordability, housing, etc. has been talked about. A second space which actually hasn't, been talked about much, at least I'm not aware of it, however exists in reality and is an important resource and research space to be tapped, is actually working women's hostels. I say it also from a very personal experience. I came to Delhi to work in 2010, and for the first 10 months, I actually stayed at a working women's hostel in Delhi. And it gave me an insight into how big this area is for so many different kinds of women coming from so many different cities of different age, caste, class, for whom the working women's hostel, one, is affordable, but two, is also safe because of the kind of restrictions that the working women's hostels, have. Yeah, so that's actually another space, I think, where we should look at and think about how do we talk about, affordability and women working, especially single women working. Where will they stay in big cities? So one, students, two, working women. A third, and this I as I was thinking about this, there's a very recent essay that somebody called Shushmita Pati wrote in The Wire. This is July 2020. The essay is titled, "It's the Right Time to Speak of Housing Rights in India," and that time is right now. And I want to quote one paragraph from this essay, which kind of resonates, I think, with the quote that you did from my EPW piece. And I quote Shushmita: "A Muslim family, single woman, find it extremely hard to find a place to rent across cities. Older Brahmin-dominated localities in Bangalore and Chennai have consistently refused to let out to non-vegetarians who are more often than not non-Brahmins. So these injunctions are well known and yet fail to cause a stir. What is curious is that across classes, we see housing as an individualized problem, dependent on negotiations struck with respective landlords." And she goes on to actually say that during Corona, during the pandemic times, hashtag no rent during COVID times, these kinds of hashtags actually came. And I think what I would want to take from what she has said and connect it to what I tried to articulate, and I still think that it's an important conversation to do, is that housing is not an individualized problem. If we look at who is denied affordable housing, and because of a certain kind of social profile, why is it that you cannot get housing in certain spaces in different metropolitans in India? It doesn't make it an individual problem at all. It is a social problem. It is a sociological, therefore needing a sociological inquiry into it. And I would, think that, questions of intersectionality of class, caste, religion, and yes, very importantly, heteronormativity needs to come in the conversation around housing. So how to move from, the HRLN kind of a discourse to the discourse around, collective affordable housing for people of various genders. I think, again, the pandemic has shown that it is important to raise the issue and talk about it further.
So the United Nations has actually played an important role in foregrounding the, gender question. Connecting it to what you have said about housing, how do you see the role of, maybe the UN or the civil society in looking at these questions?
So it is very important to note that the United Nations actually came out with a policy brief, which they called "Impact of COVID-19 on Women." And this was as early as April 9, 2020. And it kind of started, the policy brief started by reminding all of us that this year, 2020, is actually the 25th year from what is known as the Beijing Platform for Action. And the Beijing Platform for Action is actually a huge, leap, I would think, in, women's rights as human rights kind of a rhetoric that we got 25 years ago. And the United Nations kind of says in that report that while the world should have been celebrating Beijing plus 25, what, however, has happened is that the world is, encountering and confronting a pandemic. But having said that, this particular report, I think, makes 2 or 3 very important points, which I would want to say as a response to the question that you ask. The report says the pandemic is deepening pre-existing inequalities, exposing vulnerabilities, in social, political, and economic systems, which are in turn amplifying the impacts of the pandemic. And I think whatever I have said till now, be it with, the understanding of housing, or be it in the way in which we would want to conceptualize the home, we are actually seeing an increase and a deepening of pre-existing socio-economic political inequalities, and a very different way in which vulnerabilities are being manifested, depending upon which kind of a social, background one belongs to. This UN report actually suggests that there is a need to the way in which they think that the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on women, how is it that they would want to address it? They suggest three things. Number one, ensure women's equal representation in all COVID-19 response planning and decision making. Number two, drive transformative change for equality by addressing the care economy, paid and unpaid. And number three, target women and girls in all efforts to address the socioeconomic impact of COVID-19. I would think that various civil society initiatives in India post the COVID-19 pandemic have been addressing some of these efforts that the United Nations policy brief talked about in April 2020.
Thank you, ma'am, for that answer. So now a question about your recent book. So in your book, you discuss about, doing feminism. So I would want to ask you that what do you think would be some of the challenges of conducting feminist research, particularly keeping in mind the present context?
Okay. So I'll answer it in two, parts. One is in relation to a particular chapter that I write in the book. And I think that that addresses challenges of doing, feminist research, if I may add, feminist research and teaching, and what it is to do it, what are the kind of specific challenges during, let's say, the pandemic and the post-pandemic time. So I'll try and address it in two parts. The first part is to answer that, I would refer to the essay that I write in the book, which is titled Between Discomfort and Negotiations, Reflections on Teaching Law Through Feminist Sociology. I should say here that one of the influences of writing this chapter has been reading and then teaching Professor Moitri Chaudhury's essay around teaching gender in classrooms, in sociology classrooms, an Indian Journal of Gender Studies essay that she wrote many years ago. I should say that writing this chapter, I was probably trying to converse with some of the discussions that she did in that essay many years ago. So this particular chapter in, doing feminisms in the academy deals with the concept of discomfort or trouble, which a feminist classroom, I believe, necessarily creates. And I would want to actually push this and say that discomfort or trouble is not something which just the classroom creates, but because the classroom creates, therefore the research also will create and propagate certain kinds of discomforting questions, which does not necessarily mean destabilizing, but discomforting questions is what will lead us towards a transformative research. So that's my first point that I would want to say. A second thing that I would want to say is that through the conducting of this course is titled Law and Society, and I've been doing it since 2013 at Ambedkar University, Delhi. Through this course, ideas of feminism as well as interpretations of law have generated certain kinds of discomfort among students and the kind of research questions that they explore in their term papers, etc. And I'll talk about three of these areas of discomfort very quickly. One is a discomfort or a trouble between the self and interpersonal relationships between, let's say, kins and friends, as well as maybe with the identified feminist teacher, in this case, me. A second kind of a discomfort is about the institution of heterosexual monogamous marriage. The contradiction between the legal right as a citizen to marry anyone of one's choice. However, the social restrictions of endogamy, religion, sexual identity, ethnicity. What better time to talk about this but now in the current, context. And a third, about whether the law is a site of hope, despair, exasperation, or justness. And I think, these kinds of, discomforting and troubling questions that we deal with in the classroom, which they take into, I would think, the kind of research questions that they explore through their term paper, that only enables a certain kind of, or rather creates the basis of a certain kind of a transformative pedagogy. So I would want to believe that despite the challenges of the discomfort or the trouble, the hope of feminist, pedagogy and the hope of feminist research is its transformative potential. And one of the main objectives of feminist research being feminist consciousness raising. So I would tend to think that the challenge and the hope coexist when we think about feminist research and teaching. To the second part of your question about, is there anything specific about the current moment and challenges to feminist research and teaching? So I actually would want to say that COVID and pandemic, the lockdown, has emboldened some of the practice that have already been a part of feminist research, teaching, and pedagogy. Number one, questions around decolonizing the course outline or the way one does research through creating conversations is something which I would think is a very integral part of feminist pedagogy. A second is using the autobiographical, the life narrative, the literary, the visual as different kinds of texts of feminist teaching, or, journaling as a kind of assignment. I would think that, the way in which the entire academy shifted online, these certain kinds of feminist, pedagogic practices that some of us, I suppose, have been doing for a long time. I remember Professor Aparajita Pathak's class was the first class which taught me that you can do a diary entry as an assignment. And I kind of carry it on till now. I make sure that there is a diary entry assignment that my students write. That's journaling, right? And there is a way in which you create knowledge through that. So I would think COVID has emboldened that. And a third is how to not reproduce institutional structures of hierarchy inside, to me, inside a classroom, because I identify primarily as a teacher. So the way COVID has changed thinking for feminist pedagogy is to also think about crisis and resilience. I would think that one of the very, very important concepts that post-COVID we need to think about is concepts around crisis, but also around resilience. How is it that you endure despite crisis? And how is it that you endure with hope? I think feminist research enables us to have conversations like this also.
Thank you. I think taking from what you've just, said, that in the post-COVID society, feminist research will definitely have a lot of significance. So what I want to ask you is, how do you imagine the post-COVID society to be like? So, what should we expect for the different sections then?
That's a tough one, but one of my first responses to this would be that how do we assess, engage, and talk about isolation and connectedness? I think, and I'm not using them as binaries, I'm trying to actually see how is it that these have coexisted, right? And if you realize, COVID has actually shown how isolation and connectedness have coexisted. And I go back to, one of the concepts around the home, which is, this tremendous anxiety, but also the hope of returning home. And the fact that, many couldn't, the fact that many actually stay away from home would also mean that they have created homes in some ways. But those could be isolating spaces. And, through probably, the virtual platforms showed us that there are ways in which connectedness is possible. So isolation and connectedness is one, way in which I would think that we would have to, imagine and think about the post-COVID world. And when I'm saying this, I think there's value in going back to Zimmel and looking at the concept of the stranger in the city, and to think about that if the city itself is a lonely city, as Oliver Liang says, then how is it that we talk about, loneliness, isolation, and connectedness through the virtual? So that's my first point. A second point is that the COVID has been a very important lesson for us to realize that the virtual can do only that much. And while the virtual has done a lot, we actually also realize the importance of being physically present. The importance of being physically present, the importance of touch and the physical touch are, to express love, to express intimacy, probably also to express, despair. All of that is important. To be there as a person in flesh and blood. So COVID has shown, however much COVID has shown, that the virtual can take us to a huge extent, but it has also shown the limits of online. It has also shown the limits of, what happens when there is a restriction of mobility. So that is something that COVID has shown us. And I would think that the post-COVID world has to then conceptually think about, virtual and the limits of the virtual. So to reclaim the physical space. Yeah, that's something then that is important. A third thing that I would want to say is that it is important to kind of remember the kind of words that COVID has thrown us, and to then think about what to do with these words. I just, spell out the words because I don't want to get into the details of it. Social distancing, quarantine, self-isolation, or the experience of situation like death without mourning, without collective mourning. How is it that you engage, talk about death and grief? So I therefore think that in a post-pandemic, world, this public health emergency has reshaped meanings and metaphors around public spaces, liberty, surveillance, care, intimacy. And that is, conceptually, these would be things that as, people within the discipline of sociology, which has always been welcoming to, newer concepts and newer, newer ideas, I would think that the post-COVID sociology will actually look at some of these concepts in a more rigorous manner.
So we're almost, towards the end of the interview. I wanted to ask if you would want to say something to young researchers, something that they should keep in mind.
Empathy is the first word that comes to mind. That doing research is not just about knowing the other. Doing research is knowing oneself as well. And, as I say it again, as all of us being in the discipline of sociology, we would, recollect reflexivity of Bourdieu. And I think that is what I'm, have in mind when I'm saying that doing empathetic research is something which is very, very valuable. So it is not to think about that, there's a person who is waiting out there to give me information, to be my respondent, who necessarily is in the hierarchy of landscapes, probably lower than me as the researcher. But how do you actually break these hierarchies? How do you empathetically reach out to another person while doing research? How do you learn about that person? But then what do you learn about oneself? So, research is a journey in empathy. Research is also a journey in transformative praxis. And that transformation is happening of oneself as well. And I think the last thing that I would want to say is that it's just so valuable to remain curious. Curiosity and responding to the needs of the contemporary times, to engage with contemporary realities and reimagine sociological concepts. Durkheim also started with Durkheim and the discipline of sociology actually started with disorder. And that's why order became one of the most important concepts in sociology. I think it's a very interesting moment. And, I'm remembering Sylvia Wolby's book, Crisis, which actually came post the financial crisis in UK. It's an important moment today, again, where we are encountering crisis and we need to talk about resilience. And I would think that is something which, future researchers, I hope, will definitely talk about. We'll talk about resilience and hope and meander and get to know the social in more enriched and more enriching ways, which will lead to a change in one's self as well, just like a broader transformation.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much. I think, you've put it beautifully. Our young viewers, researchers would listen to you and take a lot from, what you've said. And also, I think is, women, I'm talking about myself, Rituparna as well, would agree that, we could relate to a lot of what you've talked about, as women, young women in cities trying to find spaces, safe spaces. So I think, it has been just absolutely incredible talking to you. And we would like to tell our viewers to read your book, get a copy of the book. It's available online, and then definitely read it. And thank you again for taking time out to do this interview today with us.
Thank you to Deepali and Rituparna, and thank you to Doing Sociology for having me do this conversation and for the wonderful questions that you had for this conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am.